Kind of cold out there, isn't it? Just a little bit, gee. We may have more folks online tonight than we have in person. Y'all, thanks for coming out. It's hard to, I like having our online folks, of course, but I also like having some faces in front of me. So, before I start, I'm going to go ahead and hand out this. I have one handout, and folks who are online, this is on Facebook. We sent this out earlier. It's only handout, and it's a map. So it is on the church's Facebook page if you want to look at it or pull it down or something like that. So just so we kind of know where we're talking about. Yeah, I got plenty of copies. I can. There you go. I made plenty. There you go. There you go. I'm gonna lay some of these maybe right. I'll lay some of these are just right here on this front pew. If somebody comes in and stand next to you, you can say there's some there on that front pew. So I want to welcome everybody. It feels like it's been a long time with between all the holidays and New Year and everything. It's just been a long time, and I'm glad this week to really get back to something like the normal routine. Although every week's a little different, including this one. But I do like routine. Although I love the holidays, and the sanctuary always looks just a little bare after we take down all the Christmas decorations. It always feels a little sparse in here, but that's what makes it special. Hand up here. Before I really get started. Oh, here, I'll just put it right there. All right, and I'll let you grab that. I find that the story that starts in 1 Samuel and goes to the end of 2 Samuel, which is a saga really about three major characters: Samuel, King Saul, David. The saga that takes up those two books, which in the Hebrew Bible is just one book. It's just the book of Samuel. Is one of the most fascinating parts of the whole story of how God's people went from slaves in Egypt to wandering in the desert to taking over the area of Palestine, and how that transitions into a monarchy. And it is not an easy road. It is not a smooth road, and it's full of a lot of things that actually sound not that different from today in some of the ways that people act and react. The timing of this is somewhere between 1100 and 1000 BC. We usually date, one of the easiest things to date is David's monarchy is right around the year 1000 BC. David is approximately 1,000 years before Jesus. We may be off by 50 or 60 years one way or the other. David from somewhere between 950 BC to 1050 BC, so somewhere in there. It's pretty hard to date when you go back that far with accuracy. But around 1000 BC is when we tend to date the time of David. So this is occurring before that, 50, 60 years before that, where we start. And if you remember, last semester, I spent several weeks talking about the Judges. And the Judges is historically the part of the Bible that really falls right before this. Now, the book of Ruth is in there kind of as a romance, historical story in between Judges and 1 Samuel that gives us a little bit of insight into what was going on, but especially gives us insight into one of David's ancestors. But we go from the period of the Judges to this book of Samuel. And just to recap kind of how we get here, super fast, Exodus tells us about how all the descendants of Abraham who ended up in Egypt, well, even go back before that, how all those descendants of Abraham, the sons of Jacob, Israel, who were invited into Egypt as guests to avoid famine. 400 years later, they've multiplied greatly and they're slaves. And Exodus is the story, of course, of how God calls Moses to deliver them out of that slavery with signs and wonders and the 10 plagues. And they come out of Egypt and they get to the border of the promised land. They send scouts or spies into there. 10 out of the 12 spies say, we'll never take this land. They're too big, they're too strong. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, say, we can do it with the Lord's help. Because of the people going, oh, we can't go in there, we can't go into Canaan. God says, well, you're not going to go then. You're going to wander for 40 years until the older generation dies out and the younger generation goes in. Finally, under Joshua's leadership, they do go in and begin to take Canaan as their possession, one battle at a time, starting in Jericho and on and on and on. And they take the land of Canaan. It's divided into the 12 tribes. Although even that, there is no tribe of Joseph. There's 2 half-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh that are his 2 sons. There is no land allocated to the Levites because they're the priestly tribe. And so they don't have land, they have income from serving as priests. So you do have 12 territories. The 11 tribes, 10 tribes, 2 half-tribes, and then the Levites are serving everybody. So you have that, but there's no one leader, tribal leadership. Each tribe is somewhat autonomous. When they're threatened by an enemy from the outside, they have to pull together, and that period we call the Judges is where God would often raise up a dynamic or charismatic leader, a judge, not like our judge who sit on the bench in a black robe, but really a military, temporary general. And we talked about a few of those. Like Gideon is one of the judges. Samson, who's often referred to as kind of a knucklehead, is one of the judges. We have some others, even Deborah, a female judge. We had that book of Judges, but the last sentence of the book of Judges is a summation that says, in that time, everybody pretty much did their own thing. That's a paraphrase, but every man basically followed his own conscience. There was no overarching ruler. There was no king. The tribes were all somewhat autonomous, and that's where we open up. But God did raise up these temporary leaders that was not hereditary. It wasn't, Samson and Gideon are not related from the same tribe. An occasional temporary leader would lead them against enemies when those arose. And that's where we open up 1 Samuel. And we open up 1 Samuel, instead of a story about the whole nation, we open up with a story of one family and one woman's heartache. So if we look at that story that's in 1 Samuel 1, it lists this family. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim. Now there right away, here's our map, okay? And you see that long hyphenated name there that says Ramathaim Zophim there, and that kind of right in the sort of the middle of that map. And then underneath in parentheses it says Arimathea. You see where I am now on that map? That's where we're talking about. That's the land. And it's interesting, connecting Old Testament to New Testament. Arimathea. Where do we hear that before? Where do we hear about Arimathea? Joseph of Arimathea. Who was Joseph of Arimathea? Right. He was a wealthy man who gave his burial plot, his tomb, to Jesus. When Jesus was pulled off the cross, his body is pulled off the cross, it says Joseph of Arimathea had asked permission to take custody of the body and then bury it in his own unused tomb, which is where Jesus is buried. And So that's where Arimathea that's where Joseph was from, that area right there. Joseph, Arimathea. So that's just acclimating us to the geography. The tribe of Ephraim is right there in the middle of our action for this story. The Ephraim and Manasseh are these half-tribes, the two sons of Joseph. That's why there's no tribe of Joseph. They get a double portion, a double inheritance. You see the tribe of Benjamin right below that. You see the tribe of Dan over to the west of that. And then below is the large tribe of Judah. And we see the familiar, familiar towns, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, etc. We see some of the other names that are going to come up, like Gath down there. This is a little more tougher question, trivia question. Who was from Gath? Not an Israelite. A Philistine named Goliath. Yeah, Goliath of Gath. So that's who was from Gath. We'll get to him eventually. But anyway, so, and Shiloh, there in the red, Shiloh is where we're going to see where the tabernacle, the place of worship was held. So anyway, that's acclimating us to where these people are from. We start off in this Ramathaim Zophim. There was a man from there whose name was Elkanah, son of Joraham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, and he's an Ephraimite. In other words, he's from the tribe of Ephraim. I'm not sure a lot of us could go even back that far with 5 generations back and off the top of our head name our ancestors. But this man, Elkanah, he had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And this is the setup of this first story. And it says, year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. There on the map again, the red letter city, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. So this is a place, there was, in the days of disorganization and all the tribes, there was sometimes more than one holy place where Yahweh was worshipped. But the predominant one in this part was Shiloh. This is before Jerusalem becomes the capital. This is before David makes it the city of David and all that. So we find out that there is a priest at Shiloh. He has 2 sons who are also priests, and we're going to find out that the Ark of the Covenant is there at Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant is there at Shiloh. That goes back to the time of Moses, where inside the Ark of the Covenant, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna, Moses' staff, and I always say, if you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know kind of what it looks like. It's a big oblong box, gold, 2 angels on the lid. That's also located there at Shiloh, where these priests were operating. Whenever the day came, I'm in verse 4, for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Now, one thing about the Old Testament is when it will say the Lord did this or the Lord did that, sometimes that is not meaning God singled this person out to do something. It's the idea in the Old Testament that God is over everything. The Lord is in control of all history. But it's not always meant to mean he personally picked on this person or did something like that. But Hannah is, as it says, barren, which, without going too much into that, in the ancient world and all through the scriptures, for a woman, this is a terrible thing. This is before modern science, obviously. This is before lots of the recourses that women have today who want to have a child, who have a difficulty conceiving. This was considered a huge embarrassment, and women felt great guilt over this, and husbands often felt it was their fault. And I mean, it's a really a terrible situation. And yet, throughout the scriptures, there's several women who are called, quote, barren, starting with Abraham's wife, Sarah, if you remember. When God says to Abraham, you're going to be the father of a multitude, as many as the stars in the sky. And that's when there's a lot of stars in the sky you could actually see. But Sarah is well past the age of childbearing, and she's never had a child, which is why the birth of her son Isaac is such a big deal. The New Testament, same thing with Elizabeth in the New Testament. When she finally conceives, it's a big deal. There are Rachel in one of Jacob's 4 wives. She has a hard time conceiving. It's a big deal. It was in the ancient world, it carried a huge stigma. Thankfully now we have other ways to help people. My daughter Lainey has been public on Facebook about both of her children, our grandkids, were born with IVF, in vitro fertilization. Both of Lainey's kids were born that way. And we have those kinds of things available to us now. So anyway, but Hannah is barren. She can't conceive. And her rival, in other words, the other wife, because Eli has 2 wives, which is not super common in this time, but certainly wealthier men who had means would often have more than 1 wife. And almost every story in the Bible where someone has more than 1 wife, there is trouble. Rachel and Leah, Jacob's 2 wives, are sisters that he marries and are constantly at each other's throats, constant rivals. Anytime really in the Old Testament where you see someone with multiple wives, it usually proceeds to cause problems. And it causes problems here because her, quote, rival irritates her, provokes her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, in other words, the tabernacle, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you so downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? But his other wife would constantly needle her, remind her that she had all these children and she had none, was constantly bugging her about it. Once, when they'd finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, and again, when you're talking about, when you go to Shiloh to worship, and I've said this many a time, but our concept of going to worship is, coming here once a week and we read from the scriptures and we sing and we pray and et cetera, et cetera. Worship in the Old Testament is periodically going to the tabernacle and later the temple. Remember, the tabernacle is the temporary sanctuary. There's finally a permanent temple built under Solomon. Going to the tabernacle and bringing an offering, an animal to be sacrificed on the altar, a burnt offering. That was how you worshiped the God, bringing an animal for sacrifice. But when you would bring an animal for sacrifice, usually what the priest would do would be he would take a representative piece of the animal, often the fatty parts, and burn that, keep part of the animal for himself. That's how the priests supported themselves, and give the rest of the animal back to the worshiper to then have a feast or a meal in celebration of their devotion to the Lord. Occasionally, the entire animal would be burned up, but that was rare. And I've said this before, ironically, whenever there was a special type of offering where they burned up the entire animal, which was called a Holocaust offering, which is why the horrors of World War II were called the Holocaust. But this is the normal kind of offering was they burned a part of the meat. The priest kept part of the meat as his payment, gave the rest of the meat back to the worshiper. And then the priest who, if that's how he got paid, couldn't possibly eat all that meat himself, they would sell excess meat to people. It was the tabernacle / butcher shop. That's where people went to buy meat. And again, so that's very different from the way we think about worship, but that's how we're talking about Old Testament worship. So they would go, and they would have the meal, and they would worship. And it says after they'd finished eating and drinking, in other words, eating probably part of the sacrifice they'd brought, Hannah stood up, and Eli the priest was sitting in a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple, which actually, as I say, tabernacle would be the appropriate word, because the differentiation is tabernacle was the temporary sanctuary, temple was what Solomon built later on. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. So she's basically says, Lord, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you to serve you his whole life. And if you remember back from the Samson story that some of you heard us talking about, not cutting hair was part of what was usually called a Nazirite vow. It was a vow of dedication to the Lord. Samson, they made that vow when he was young as well. He was not good at keeping it, because as a Nazirite, you were not supposed to touch dead bodies or drink wine or all kinds of things that he did. But the idea of a Nazirite vow was you're dedicated to the Lord. So a Nazirite vow often was for a period of time, but she's saying, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you to serve you his whole life. She kept on praying to the Lord, verse 12. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. And Eli thought she was drunk. Again, why would he think that? Because almost all prayer was spoken out loud. When you went to the tabernacle to pray, when you went to the temple to pray, you prayed out loud. Our custom of silent prayer is not common in this time period. Almost all prayer is spoken prayer. Because again, in a more primitive understanding of God, how's God going to hear you if you don't speak out loud? So almost all prayers were spoken prayers. So the fact that she's kind of whispering her prayer, because she's so overwrought with emotion, the priest decides she must be drunk. And 14 had said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get ready your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Don't take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Oh, she's saying, I'm not drunk. I was praying. Eli answered, well, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. So she has faith that God has heard this prayer. Early the next morning, they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then they went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel. Samuel, meaning, because I asked the Lord for him. The name Samuel means heard of God. In other words, his name means God heard me. That's what Samuel means, God heard me. So that's why she names him Samuel. When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, and this annual, the chances are they only go to Shiloh once a year for a festival to worship. Hannah didn't go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I'll take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Again, difference in culture and time. In the ancient world, children often were breastfed until they were 2 or 3 years old, which is not common in our culture. but often children continue to breastfeed into age 2 or even age 3. So when we're talking about weaning. Do what seems best to you, Elkanah, her husband, told her. Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. So we're assuming he's, let's say, 3 years old. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, which is where this place of worship was. When they'd slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood there beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he'll be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. So now suddenly the old priest has a 3-year-old. They don't really go into how that would impact his daily routine, because we're going to find out this priest is not a young man. He has 2 grown sons who are also priests. But now she has fulfilled her vow and said, "My son, I give him back to the Lord to serve here at Shiloh, to serve here in the tabernacle for the rest of his life." Okay, and then she prays. And then chapter 2, or at least the first half of chapter 2, is, at least in my Bible, is written out like a psalm. And let me not read all of it, but it begins, "My heart rejoices in the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance." Her enemies, well, her main enemy is the other wife, of course. "There's no one holy like the Lord. There's no one beside you. There's no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him your deeds are weighed." Again, probably directed at her rival. And then a lot of how those who are opposed to the Lord are brought low, and God brings judgment and exalts the poor and the needy. And then kind of winds up, let's pick it up with, in the middle of verse 8, "The foundation of the earth of the Lord's, upon them he has set the world. He'll guard the feet of the saints. The wicked will be silenced. Not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He'll give strength to his king, exalt the horn of his anointed." So she sings this song of praise. And this is, again, several places in the Bible. Often women, after a prayer request or a miracle, there is a chapter or a place of a song of praise. Miriam, if you remember, after the parting of the Red Sea, there's a whole chapter of Miriam's song. Miriam sings and praises, how God has delivered them through the waters and drowned the Egyptians, and she goes on, they're dead, they're drowned, their chariots, and she praises with the symbol there. A more famous song of praise after a miracle is, of course, Mary's song, or Mary's prayer after the visit of Gabriel that we just got through talking about during Christmas, where after Gabriel tells Mary she's to be the mother of the Lord, she has this song of Mary that's been, of course, turned into a song and is very well known. So there's several places where this song happens, but this is Hannah's song in chapter 2 there of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, where the song of Hannah after God grants, for those who just walked in, God grants her prayer to have a child, even though she'd been barren. She gives birth to a son, Samuel, and then gives him back to the Lord to serve in the temple for the rest of his life. So now we have this temple at Shiloh, where Eli, the old priest, and his 2 sons, who are also priests, served the people who come there to worship. And now this little kid, this little boy, Samuel, is given to them to raise, to serve the temple or to serve the tabernacle the rest of his life. But we find out that all things are not that great there in that tabernacle in 1 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Samuel 2, starting now at verse 12. Eli the priest at Shiloh, Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. So Eli is like the chief priest. His two sons are also priests, but they are not good men. They are wicked men. Now, we're going to describe how they're wicked, what they're doing. Now, it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or the pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. Again, when you think about, the job of a religious leader, this is not anything I've ever done. They bring their animal for sacrifice. They're boiling it. The priest or his servant takes a three-pronged fork, puts it in the meat, pulls it up, and whatever comes on the fork, that's his payment. That's how the priest gets his payment. Whatever comes up on the fork, that is what the priest takes away from the sacrifice. Okay? That was the normal way that the priest got his share of the sacrifice. Okay? But, verse 15, even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." So he's breaking protocol here. The way it had always been done was stick a fork in the boiling meat and pull out whatever the fork can bring out. Now, these two sons of Eli are saying, no, we want it raw. In other words, we want a bigger chunk. We want more of the meat before you even cook it. If the man said to him, "Well, let the fat be burned up first and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." So these two priests, these two sons of Eli, are cheating, are extorting, are dipping into the till, whatever you would call it. This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. So, again, I say, when you hear about religious leaders, corruption in terms of financial matters, this is right here, early on, you've got a couple of crooked priests who are taking more than they should from the offering. It says, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight. They were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel, now we're assuming now Samuel is now not just a baby or a toddler anymore. He's, probably several years later. It says, he was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. So, and linen ephod is like the garment of a priest. So he's like a little mini priest. And he's wearing a little mini priest outfit, working there at the tabernacle. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. So she's given him to the Lord. So Hannah only sees her little boy once a year, and every year she'd bring him a little priest outfit as he got bigger and taller. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." In other words, let this not be her only child. Then they'd go home, and the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Okay, so she's no longer barren. She has now 5 more children. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. So year at a time, he goes from a little boy priest to adolescent priest to teenage priest, or at least servant of the priest. They're working at the tabernacle under Eli. Now Eli, who was very old, and that's going to come into play too. Eli is very old, heard about everything his sons were doing, in other words, cheating the people and taking all the meat and all that, to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Okay, now we not only have financial hanky-panky, we have other kinds of hanky-panky. They are now sleeping with the women who work there as servants at the tabernacle. And again, sadly, you hear about scandal of religious leaders, financial or sexual. Here it is, both right here, 3,000 years ago. He's sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, Eli says to his two sons, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours." "No, my sons, it's not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?" His sons, however, didn't listen to their father's rebuke, and it was the Lord's will to put him to death. And again, it's not saying they were preordained for death. It's saying because of their sinfulness and wickedness, that was what was in store for them. Notice, okay, so Eli says, "Boys, stop that. Stop doing that." And they ignore him and just keep doing it. His scolding is ignored, and he doesn't do anything else to change it. "Now stop that, you boys," and they just keep doing it. But, verse 26, the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. So we have two tracks happening here. We have these two sons, the two biological sons. The two biological sons of Eli are wicked, corrupt priests, financially and sexually. Meanwhile, this little boy, who is sort of an adopted child there working at the tabernacle, continues to grow in favor with the Lord, continues to grow physically and spiritually. Now, verse 27. A man of God, in other words, a prophet, a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes in Israel to be my priest." Who's he referring to? Who's the first priest? Aaron, right. The first priest is Aaron, Moses' brother. He says your father, it would be your ancestor. I mean, not literally his father. It's his many times removed, but he's saying your forefather. Aaron, I chose to be the first priest. Out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod in my presence. I gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? In other words, the tasty cuts of meat. Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor. Those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done in Israel, in your family line, there will never be an old man. In other words, never will they live to an old age. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared only to blind your eyes with tears, to grieve your heart, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be assigned to you. They will both die on the same day. I'll raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I'll firmly establish his house. He will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a crust of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so that I can have food to eat. So these, Eli, who is a descendant of the first priest, Aaron, is told by an unnamed, said man of God, in other words, a prophet, a messenger from God, that because of, one, his son's wickedness, and two, his unwillingness to do anything about it, that their line will be cut off. And God will raise up someone else to lead and to be the priest. God will raise up someone else. And of course, we're about to find out who that someone is going to be, which will not be a big surprise if you've been following what's been happening here. So, for chapter 3. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. In other words, there were not many prophets who proclaimed, thus saith the Lord, or who had visions. One night, Eli, who's really old, remember, he's an old man. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the tabernacle of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Remember, this is the ark of the covenant. This is the big gold box with the angels on the lid. This is the ark of the covenant. Then the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I didn't call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lied down. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. He'd been working in the tabernacle. What it meant was he had never heard God speak to him. He had never heard God call him. He heard a voice calling him by name and assumed it was Eli. He didn't know the voice of God. The word of the God had not been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time. Samuel got up, went to Eli, and said, "Here I am, you called me." And Eli realized that it was the Lord who was calling the boy. Eli told Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood there, calling as in the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. I told him," in other words, through the messenger earlier, through the prophet earlier, "I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and he was afraid to tell Eli the vision. And understandably, he's afraid to tell the content of this vision. But Eli called and said to him, "Samuel, my son?" Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. And Eli said, "He's the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, this is the northernmost tribe to the southernmost tribe. That's why from Dan to Beersheba. From Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. So we're going to see Samuel as very unique in the Old Testament. Samuel we're going to see as priest, prophet, and the last judge. Samuel is going to be the last of the judges. He's going to be a priest, and he's also going to be a prophet. He is really going to combine all of these roles into one, which is one reason Samuel is lifted up as such a monumental figure in the Old Testament. From childhood, he grows to be this servant of God who plays this role. And so, Samuel keeps getting older and older and older, and his wisdom and his ability to communicate the word of the Lord, starts to grow and grow and grow. Now, we're going to hear about the Philistines. And the Philistines, play a role all through this story as sort of the enemy of Israel. In other times, Israel has other enemies. All the ites, all the Canaanites, the Jebusites and the Hivites and all the other ites that we hear about when they're conquering the land. And later on, of course, Israel is going to face all kinds of, they're going to face Assyrians and Babylonians and all kinds of other enemies. But in this part of history, their primary enemy is the Philistines. And secular historians believe, and I don't know of all the evidence for this, they believe the Philistines actually originated in the Greek islands and made their way to Palestine and settled there on the coast. If you see on your map again, you see there right on the coast of the Mediterranean, you see Philistines, and you see these cities, Joppa and Ekron and Ashdod, and even down to there to Gath. This is Philistine territory. This is where the Philistines were settled. They were coastal people. But in the time of this book, they begin to move eastward. They begin to try to take the land that the Israelites have settled. So the Philistines are encroaching, moving into the territory that the Israelites had conquered during the book of Joshua and Judges. And that's where the clashing is, as the Philistines are trying to expand their territory. Again, most historians would say, again, even outside of the scriptures, the Philistines probably were maybe not as numerous as the Israelites, but they had better weapons. They had chariots. They had metal. Their weaponry was superior. Even if their numbers were not, their weaponry was superior. And they were more trained in battle. When the Israelites ran into trouble, it was like, oh, gather up all the farmers and the shepherds and the, whoever, and let's go fight. They were not a professional army or a group of military men. They were like, oh, everybody show up and let's go fight. So the Philistines had more sophisticated weaponry and probably better trained soldiers, and the Jews or the Israelites were much more, hey, we got to all go defend our territory. Hey, come on, farmer. Come on, shepherd. Come on, let's go fight. Which put them at a disadvantage, obviously. So, in chapter 4, it says, the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. And the Israelites camped at Ebenezer, which every time you see Ebenezer, you think, what do you think of? We think of Ebenezer Scrooge, right? And I've told this story before, but what an Ebenezer is a rock monument to God. where God does some miracle at a particular site, and they're like, we want to remember what God did at this site. So they would pile up a whole bunch of rocks as a monument, and on this site, God did this miraculous thing, you know. And in that song, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, here I raise my Ebenezer," da, 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 da. And you've probably sung that song, that hymn, and I don't know what that is, but I'm going to raise it. And I have told this story, but you may not have heard it. Janine says I repeat myself sometimes. But when I was in seminary, first year seminarian, before there was modern worship, before there was praise and worship, really, and we're still just singing hymns in chapel. We're singing that hymn. We're singing "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," and we come to that verse, "Here I raise my Ebenezer," and the dean of the chapel went, "Stop!" Told the organist to stop. He looked at all of us seminarians and he said, "What's an Ebenezer?" And we were like, oh. None of us knew what it was. We didn't know what an Ebenezer was. And he then told us what an Ebenezer was, which is why I always remember it. But anyway. So the Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let's bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hands of our enemies." Okay, so you see the thinking here. Okay, they've gone out, they've lost the battle of the Philistines. How can we win? We will march into battle carrying the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, the idea being, this is the power of God here. And if we carry the Ark of the Covenant with us into battle, God will win the battle for us. And not to keep referring to a movie, which is entirely fictional, but do you remember the plot of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Why does Hitler want the Ark of the Covenant? Because he believes if he can get the Ark of the Covenant, the Nazi army can march into battle with the Ark of the Covenant and defeat anybody. Because, and this is, the movie's entirely fictional, but Hitler did believe in a lot of superstitious things, and he was very superstitious in a lot of ways. Because in the context of the movie, which is not that far from being true about Adolf Hitler, he saw this thing is magic, and I can use it. I can use this magic to win. I can control the power of God if I have control of the Ark of the Covenant. I can use it and control it. If you remember the end of that movie, at the end, you remember the Nazis do have it. But someone pointed out, everything Indiana Jones does, at the end of the movie, the Nazis still have the Ark of the Covenant, and he and Marion are tied up, and the Nazi guy has put on the priestly robes of a Jewish priest, and he's saying the words in Hebrew, and the lid flies off of the ark, and every Nazi melts, if you remember. And even though it's entirely fictional, Spielberg is Jewish. The point is, you can't control God. You cannot just say, as long as I have this, I can control the power of God. You cannot control God. And here is really where, in some ways, that idea comes from, is they think, well, as long as we bring the ark into battle, then we're assured to win. It's not about them being obedient to God. It's not about them praying to God. It's about them saying, as long as we have this box, we'll win. Well, if you see the movie, it's in this warehouse in Washington, D.C. No, we do not know where it is. The assumption, sadly, is that when the Babylonians sacked the temple and destroyed it in the 8th century, that when the Babylonians destroyed the temple, in 586. It was in 586. In 586 is when Babylon came and destroyed the walls of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. The assumption is, it never says this in the Bible, is that the Babylonians, since it's coated in gold, since the Ark of the Covenant was covered with gold, that the Babylonians took it back to Babylon. And, after that, it's lost. Yeah, but there, I think the point is their faith was in God, not in the ark. I mean, the Old Testament, I think, does pretty clearly is there's a difference between faith in God and faith in, a thing. Remember when the Israelites, as they were all through the book of Exodus, they continually are whiners and, complaining and they're always whining. And at one point, there's snakes that come and start biting them. And Moses is told to make a snake of bronze, and that heals the people. Well, guess what? It becomes an idol. And they have to destroy it because that draw to thinking the thing has power, the physical thing has power, and again, not getting too wildly out of going into movies and sci-fi and all that. I mean, in movies, how do you fight a vampire? With a cross, right? Or with holy water. Well, there's no vampires. But, my feeling would be, if there were such a thing, holding up a cross has no impact if you don't believe in Christ. I mean, a cross by itself without faith in Christ doesn't have any magic power. Holy water doesn't have any magic power. It's only faith. Faith that's what is the power, not the thing. So some of those movies where the vampire's afraid of the cross, maybe it's the person holding it, whether or not they have any belief in what that cross symbolizes. But since there's no vampires, that's something of an irrelevant conversation. But anyway, so they say, let's bring the ark into battle. So, verse 4:4. The people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who's enthroned between the cherubim. Remember, the cherubim are the two angels on the lid. And remember, cherubim is the plural of cherub, and a cherub is an angel, not a chubby baby angel. Cherubim were warrior angels. Where we associate cherub being a baby is, there's probably a history to that, but it's not accurate. Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant. So the two corrupt priests, financially corrupt, sexually corrupt, they're the ones carrying the Ark. When the Ark of the Lord's Covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised a great shout, and the ground shook. Yay, victory is assured, Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, what's going on in the Hebrew camp? When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. We're in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They're the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. Notice they don't have a clear understanding of the story. They're the gods, they say, that struck down the Egyptians. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you'll be subject to the Hebrews, as they've been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So, again showing two corrupt priests carrying the ark into battle did not win the day, did not win the battle. The Ark of the Covenant was not a magic totem to assure victory. That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line, in other words, somebody from the tribe of Benjamin, and went to Shiloh, his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli, sitting in his chair by the side of the road, watching, because his heart feared for the ark of God. Notice, it doesn't say his heart feared for his sons. His heart feared for the ark. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town set up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What's the meaning of this uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old, and whose eyes were set so that he couldn't see. He told Eli, "I've just come from the battle line. I fled from it this very day." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines. The army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had led Israel 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, one of the two sons, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the women attending her said, "Don't despair, you've given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod. Where have we heard that name? Ichabod Crane. Yeah, Ichabod Crane. And the headless horseman, right? And all that. Probably not the best name to name your child. There's some biblical names that you probably want to avoid. Ichabod would be one of them. You'd think Phinehas would probably want to be one of them too. Not too many, after the New Testament, not too many, at least Christians named Judas. Adolf fell out of favor as a name pretty quickly. Some names that you probably want to steer clear of. They named the boy Ichabod. The name Ichabod means no glory. The name Ichabod means no glory, saying the glory has departed from Israel. Because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband, she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Okay, so, yeah. By the way, I'm starting this semester, for lack of a better word. I'm only going to go to about 7:15 each night because of our schedule and when our praise team has to get started with their practice and stuff like that. So it'll be a little bit shorter, 75 minutes, but that's probably enough anyway. So let's look at chapter 5 before I got about 10 more minutes. After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it. The Philistines now have possession of this thing that they now we have the power. You know, we've captured the ark, so we've got the power now. You know, we stole it from them, from their God, so now we can use it for our. I mean, this very primitive idea of how power works and idolatry works and how you control gods. You know, how you can control. I mean, lots of things that are hopefully foreign to us. Well, don't get me started on that. But because there are preachers today who preach something that sounds awfully akin to being able to control God, really. You know, if you only have the right amount of faith, God must give you what you want. I mean, that's preached not too far from here. But anyway, after the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. Now, Dagon is one of the gods of the Philistines. Okay? Dagon is a Philistine god. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon, in other words, the idol, the statue of Dagon. There was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. But the following morning, when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So again, this is not the box. This is about them thinking they can control the power of God. His head and his hands were broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. That's why to this day, neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. This is kind of saying, notice, to this day, because when this is being written down, this is after the fact. And to this day, they still don't do that. The Lord's hand was heavy upon the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation upon them and afflicted them with tumors. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy upon us and upon Dagon our God." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, "What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" We thought this would be a great thing. It's not turning out so great that we've captured this thing. They said, "Well, have the ark of the God of Israel moved to Gath." So they moved the ark of the God of Israel. They said, "We don't want it in our town, not here. Let's take it somewhere else." And they moved it to Gath. But if they moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. And so they sent the ark of God to Ekron. We got to get, let this be somebody else's problem. And the ark of the God was entering Ekron. The people of Ekron cried out, "They brought the ark of the God of Israel around to kill us and our people." And they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it's kill us and our people." For death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy upon it. And those who didn't die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. So this did not turn out quite the way the Philistines had hoped. And we're going to see next week. And here's a little note in my Bible that I think is pretty good. It says, the Philistine strategy shows traditional magical thinking, still common in some occult or voodoo rites. And it goes on to talk about how, this idea of, I'm not sure how familiar I am with voodoo, but at least, again, from movies and things like that. What's the thing we tend to think about when we think about, at least in movies, voodoo? Like a little doll, right? Yeah, and you make it to be a likeness of somebody you don't like, and you start sticking pins in it, and supposedly, if you make the likeness of the person and start sticking pins in the doll, the person is going to feel the pricks or feel the thing, and I don't know a lot about voodoo. I know that there are places in the world where there's a strange mixture of Catholicism and voodoo called Santeria, which is where there's kind of this mixing of sort of Catholic religion with some voodoo tied in, and it has a lot of odd. When you mix those two things together, it's not a good combo. But the primitive world, we always think about, well, why were these people so drawn to idolatry? The idea of worshiping a statue, basically, because in the ancient world, so many of the other cultures, so many of the Canaanites and all these other cultures, they believed that somehow that idol, that statue of a god or goddess or whatever, contains sort of some essence of the actual god or goddess, and that by worshiping that idol, they were actually worshiping this god or goddess. And so people would go to these temples, and this is not only in Canaanites and all that, but of course you go into a little more, quote, modern, like you go to the time of Jesus, you get the Roman Empire, and there's temples everywhere. There's temples to the various gods and goddesses, and they're magnificent. They are these magnificent, to Aphrodite or Athena or Zeus or whatever, and people would bring offerings. And the temple of, say, Aphrodite, who is, or also known as Venus, same goddess. Aphrodite and Venus are the same goddess. The way you worshipped her was they had prostitutes working at the temple, and you slept with a prostitute, and that's how you worshipped Aphrodite, or that's how you worshipped Venus. And you say, well, why? Well, because they believe there was a connection between fertility gods and your crops coming in and your animals reproducing and all these other things. And they had this feeling that the worship of these gods, the god of the moon or the stars or the sun or the earth, or let's say fertility, and that's why you would see in some religions, some of the idols are not realistic. They're not like beautiful Greek statues. They're, if you've ever been to a museum and see some of these ancient idols, like, you think, oh, Aphrodite or Venus or these goddesses, they must have been these beautiful statues. No, they're squat, and they have like 100 breasts and things like that, symbolizing fertility and things like that, or the male ones you don't want to talk about, what they look like. But they have these fertility symbols, and these people believed that they were connecting with these gods when they worship these idols. And there's little there's a reason why the second commandment is no idols, no graven images, because the lure, all the way back to the golden calf in the desert. When Moses is up on the mountain, they make the golden calf. This lure to have some physical representation was so strong. And, even in Christianity, there, in not to knock, say, Catholicism, but sometimes some of the statues of saints and the medals of saints and the representations of saints, people would start to fall into something almost akin to that. Or you heard me months ago talk about relics, where people would, here's the bone of some saint, and people would gather around to see the bone of that saint. And again, it's this idea that there's some sort of power there that I think is a little too close to idolatry sometimes. But and of course I got a letter one time really saying that our sculpture of Jesus, that was idolatry. I don't think that's idolatry. I don't think anybody's out there worshiping that statue. In Islam, it is forbidden to even draw a picture of Muhammad. Muslims will not make any drawing of Muhammad or any other. I mean, if you go into a mosque, there are no paintings of anything. There's no paintings of humans or animals or anything. If you go into a mosque, it's all decorative lettering, beautiful calligraphy, but never a painting of Muhammad or anyone else, because they are so strict about falling into idolatry. So anyway, that's about all probably. We'll pick up with chapter 6 next week, and so appreciate you being here, and folks online, hopefully you are able to stay with us as well. Let me pray. Lord, as we read these stories, in some ways, Lord, it seems very foreign. In other ways, we see that the lure of corruption and idolatry and all kinds of other things are as old as humans. And so, Lord, we just ask you to protect us from falling into anything other than love for you, listening to you, knowing you're the God that hears us and loves us and is just and holy and righteous and loving, and we love you. And we thank you for these stories that help us understand where we came from, and helping us to see how you've acted all throughout history. And go with us now. We pray in your name.